Hello and welcome to PCF Kids. It's me again, Stephen. Welcome back to having my face on your screen. I know you had a face having Izzy and Sarah, and you probably missed me, but I'm back. I'm sure you didn't really miss me. Anyway, it is the 23rd of August, and I'm not really at church at the moment. I'm on holiday, but I'm so glad that you have come and joined today and watched this video, because we are starting a completely different series. We've finished with Mark for now. We may come back to that in the future, but we are starting a series on the book of Daniel. Now, you may know Daniel, probably from a children's Bible story book, or you may have been even taught it at school if you're in one of those schools that have been teaching it. But actually, you've already only heard of one story, which is Daniel in the lion's den, which we're not even looking at this week. That's going to be in a few weeks' time. Because Daniel in the lion's den comes from his book, Daniel. And it talks about what life was like to be an exile. Now, we'll get to what an exile is in just a moment. Because if we're going to fully understand Daniel, we need to fully understand where Daniel fits in the whole story of the Bible. Because the Bible is ginormous. Have you not seen it? It's like this thick. And it's like it spans over like thousands of years. Like, from the time that the Bible finished, even, it's already been 1,600 years. The Bible itself took something like 4,000 or 5,000 years to actually write. So we're going to need to know where Daniel is to fully understand it. So I've got a timeline here. We're in the church hall. I'm sure you've missed being in the church hall as well. But I'm going to use this kind of line here to help us explain where we are in the Bible. So like any timeline, we have to start at the beginning. So let's do that. So over here, we have creation, don't we? So creation starts here. So we've got the world, like this. Let me just put that up like that. Yes, and God created the world. We learnt that God creates the world, didn't we? But what happened soon after this? After this perfect world was created, we have Adam and Eve, God, the first humans, who God chose for relationship. But they broke that relationship, didn't they? And he introduced sin into the world. Because all sin is where we say, shove off God, I'm in charge, not you. And when they ate from that apple, they did exactly that. They decided that their way was better than God's way. And that caused the perfect world to be an imperfect world. Now we're going to jump a few hundred years in the future. And we come across this guy called Abraham. Now, Abraham is God's chosen person. He is, the father of everyone who has followed Jesus. He is followed God. He was chosen from a land called of all places, and God gave him 3 promises. The first promise was that he would give him a perfect land, a land flowing with milk and honey, we're told. That he will be a father of many nations, and they will be a blessing to everyone. That's what God promised Abraham. And there's lots of stories about Abraham that we could go into. But anyway, rocking on a few more hundred years, at least 400, if not 500 or 600, we come across this dude called Moses. Now, the Israelites, who are the children of Abraham, they've now numbering hundreds. They went to Egypt because there was a famine in the land, and there's all this stuff with Joseph. Read the Bible, it's in that, right? But they are being persecuted by the Egyptians. So God raises up Moses to bring them back to that promised land, that perfect land called Canaan. And to do so, we see here, they went through, famously, the Red Sea. Anyway, they went through the wilderness for 40 years. They got to the land, and then they decided they were scared of it. So they went around again in the wilderness for 40 years. And then finally, Joshua got them in. I don't know if you remember, if you've been in our kids groups on a Friday, we actually looked at Joshua very recently. Remember, we went around all those boxes and we played the trombone and we destroyed Jericho. And Joshua's reign is all about making the land God's land, and he was able to do that. But people were often not very good followers of Jesus, and they didn't even complete the task very well. After Joshua, we get some judges, Samson, Gideon, and there all the time is when people, the God's people weren't really following God, and God would raise up the judge to help them understand what it was to be a follower. But they realized that they needed a king, which actually they didn't. They needed God, but they thought a king would be like halfway house. And first they had Saul, and he was big and tough and strong, but he didn't love God and actually only used God like a superpower, and God basically got rid of him and replaced him with a king after his own heart, David. And David was brilliant. He was amazing, and he loved God. But even he failed, because humans do fail. And it actually started this problem that we're going to look at now, and it's nearly where Daniel fits in. Because it starts this little seed of where Israel and Judah are broken apart. So Israel gets divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And through David's children, who become the kings of Israel, the split gets worse and worse and worse. And actually, by the time we get to Daniel, the northern kingdom, Israel, the big one, is completely gone. They have been wiped out. We actually never see these people again. But this little one at the bottom, Judah, that does carry on. But in Daniel, they're exiled. Now, what does exile mean? Well, exile means to be in a land, to be taken away from your homeland, and to be put under the rule in some other country. You've been exiled from the world, like exit. You've been exiled from that land. And so when we find Daniel in a situation where he is an exile. He is living in a land that he is not supposed to be in. He is under a leadership that doesn't know God, actually hates God. We also see them change Daniel's name. They try and make him eat food that he doesn't want. They try and make him pray at certain things and not God. And the whole book of Daniel is looking at how does someone follow God in a country or a place or around people who don't love God. And that's really important for us, because you may not know this, but many of your friends at school, many people you'll encounter won't know Jesus, won't be Christians. And so Daniel is a really good way of helping us explore that. So in a minute, we're going to look at the first story, which is when Daniel not only gets his name changed, but also gets made to eat food that he doesn't want to eat. So let's look at that passage now. So the story goes today is taken from Daniel chapter 1. Now they're taken from their country, they're made into exiles. And here we have the four men that we are going to really look at as we look through Daniel. We've got Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Those are the names that you're going to need to remember. Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Anyway, so they're taken to the king. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire. And he comes up with this way of making sure that people didn't fight against him when he took over their countries. What he would do is he would make their leaders part of his leadership team. He would teach them the way of the Babylonians. He would teach them how to speak the Babylonian language. And he would feed them from his table. Because what he's doing is he's trying to get them to see him as their true king, for them to worship him. That is his aim. Now, for the most part, Daniel and his friends were okay with most of those ideas. They were okay with having different names, for instance, given to them, which was all part of being part of the Babylonian people. Those names I told you, apart from Daniel, whose Babylonian name was Hananiah, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are all names given to them by the Babylonians. They're not their real names. It's all part, again, of making the king the person that they worship. So they were cool with the name change. They were cool with learning the Babylonian way of doing things, and they were cool with learning the language even. But there was one thing that they wouldn't do, and it starts with Daniel. Daniel, on the day they start getting fed by the king, goes up to the king's servant and says that he does not wish to eat from the king's table, because in doing so, he is basically saying that he is now going to be at the mercy of that king, and therefore he would be seeing that king as his friend and someone to worship. But actually, and Daniel and his friends do not want to be that, which I don't think is a particularly horrible thing to do. And Daniel isn't trying to be nasty, but he's just saying that's the one thing that he does not want to do. This worries the king's servant, though, because he's saying, well, if you don't eat from the king's table, you might get sick, and the king might blame me for it, and then I might get my head chopped off. That wouldn't be very nice. So Daniel and the king's servant, hatch a plan. Daniel says, why don't we do a test? Why don't me and my mates eat only vegetables for 10 days? No wine, just water and vegetables. And if we are healthy after the 10 days, or even healthier than the king's normal men, then we can continue doing it. If we're sicker, if we're not as healthy as we should be, then we'll eat from the king's table. So that's the plan. So Daniel and his friends start eating from just vegetables and fruit and water, whilst the rest of the king's men ate wine, meat, anything they wanted. It all came from the king's table. But by the end of the week, end of those 10 days, Daniel and his friends were looking really, really fit and healthy. So much so that the king noticed how much healthier and how much better Daniel and his friends were looking. So he agreed that they could continue eating the fruit and vegetables and continue to be healthy. And this actually made them become closer to the king. The king actually liked them because they had different views and they were wise. They were wiser than anybody else in the whole of the Babylonian kingdom. Even though they went against the king, actually it resulted them in being higher and have better leadership, and actually it meant that being different led to them having higher authority in the Babylonian kingdom. That's a bit of a weird story, and I hope it doesn't mean that we all have to be vegetarians. So let's unpack that right now. Oh, this is a lot comfier. So what does that story mean? Well, does it mean that we have to be vegetarians? Does it mean that we have to change our names? Does it mean that we have to eat at king's tables? No. What this story is trying to show us is that as God's followers, there will be times that we have to be different or choose to be different to those around us. Because as I said before, not everyone is a follower of Jesus. And that means they may do and say and act differently from us from time to time. It doesn't mean that they're horrible, it doesn't mean that they're nasty, but it does mean that sometimes we might have to choose to do something different. An easy example would be on Sunday. So a lot of times there are games and activities and actually quite a lot of fun things that happen on a Sunday. And I'm sure after lockdown there are many things that you will hear about or even know that your friends will go to. But as Christians, we're called to meet together. We're called to learn about God together and worship together. And that happens on a Sunday morning, which will mean that you'll have the choice sometimes about whether you do that or whether you go and do that activity. Now, I hope what you're hearing here is actually that, like Daniel, sometimes you're going to have to make the difficult choice and go to church and be with God's people, even when the activity sounds like a lot of fun. Because I hope that doesn't mean you think that church can't be fun. I hope you know that church is fun. But it is sometimes hard because you really like that activity. For instance, when I was younger, football was a major thing. They always have football on a Sunday, and I had to choose not to go to football practice or play football games because I wanted to go to church that day. And those are the kind of choices that you might be faced with. As you get older, language can be something that happens quite often. there are a lot of people who, as they get older, start swearing and saying bad words, and sometimes they don't even think it's particularly naughty to do so, even though right now you might think that it is particularly naughty to do so. And it is, just to clarify. But as Christians, we don't want to use words that hurt other people or cause offense to other people. We want them to feel loved and feel like we are giving them an example of God to them. So we don't want to use bad words because that's what bad words do. They hurt people and they don't show a really loving and loving atmosphere. So there will always be choices, and they'll get harder as you get older sometimes. I'm sure if you talk to your parents, they might be able to tell you sometimes that they've had to make difficult choices. Maybe that's a discussion that you could have after watching this video. I really hope that you do. But there will always be those choices. Daniel had a choice to make. Sometimes the thing that was put forward to him, like changing his name, he was okay with. That was a small change. But sometimes, like the food, he wasn't willing to go that far. He wasn't willing to make King Nebuchadnezzar as high as God. And that's a choice that we're going to have to face a lot of times as well. And we need to pray for that. So I'll pray for that now, and then that'll be the end of this video. And we'll see you next week. I think next week is going to be Izzy. So I hope you enjoy hearing Izzy next week. But let's pray now. Father God, I pray that you can help us make those good choices. Like Daniel, that we can put you first, and that there will be, when we come to things like going to church or other things that go on, that we can make the right choices which help people see you. Amen. Great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe to these videos. That's just so you know when they're up. And so you don't miss one. We always want to make sure that everyone who likes watching these videos can see them. So subscribing to them will help with that. Anyway, it's been great seeing you. Bye.